In school, the history books tell us of the influential people who helped shape our world into what it is today, and in many cases the heroic feats that they accomplished. But there are some very scary and dangerous people who are not discussed in these textbooks, but their deeds are just as infamous. It took a quarter of a century for one of Israel's most baffling crimes to be solved, not thanks to diligent police work or a witness who came forward, but because of a deathbed confession made by the culprit. The incident in question took place in the spring of 1983 at the LA Mayer Museum for Islamic Art, which sees tens of thousands of visitors every year. It contains displays of rugs, jewelry, pottery, weapons, Qurans, and many watches that are considered priceless. One of the most valuable pieces among these clocks was a clock that was commissioned especially for Marie Antoinette. It was said that the commission was organized by a guard who'd fallen in love with her. But Marie Antoinette never got to see the piece, since it was so mechanically complex that it was only completed in 1827, long after she'd been executed. It was made up of over 800 parts and valued at around $30 million. It was one of the museum's most unique pieces, and it was displayed proudly. But on the morning of the 17th of April, 1983, staff arrived at the museum to make a shocking discovery. They found glass panels from display cases lying on the interior floor, along with locks that had been removed. They also found empty soda bottles, cardboard boxes, and other pieces of packing material lying around, and it became clear that the building had been burglarized. Many of the museum's paintings, artifacts, and timepieces were missing, including the clock that was commissioned for Marie Antoinette. When the police arrived, the two security guards who were on duty that night were questioned, but they immediately admitted to being asleep when the break-in took place. Furthermore, the museum's security system was faulty and hence never sounded the alarm. Investigators were baffled by the crime, since many pieces were stolen, suggesting that several thieves had worked together to pull off the heist. But the window that they used to enter and exit the building was very small, and would have only allowed a small person to fit through. The case was investigated by Interpol, private detectives, the Israeli police, and the Israeli Secret Service, and a $2 million reward was offered to anyone who could name the culprits responsible. For more than 25 years, the police followed up on every lead that they had received, and on multiple occasions, they believed that the watches had been found, but they were left disappointed each time. Investigators were reduced to scouring through auction lots in case the thieves decided to sell the pieces, but none of the watches ever came up for sale. Eventually, the museum was forced to admit defeat, and it seemed as though the burglars would never be identified. But then, in 2006, a lawyer contacted Rachel Hassan, the art director at the museum, claiming that he was representing an anonymous woman and that she was in possession of 39 of the clocks that were stolen. She stated that she wanted to return the pieces to the museum, but that she needed to remain anonymous, and that the return would come at a price. The museum agreed and offered a total of $35,000 for the clocks to be returned. When the media discovered that the missing clocks were back at the museum, they started digging into the story to uncover the anonymous woman's identity. They questioned the woman's lawyer and used other clues to find Nili Shemrat, who was living in Los Angeles. It was then discovered that she was the widow of a man named Naaman Diller, who was a well-known forger and thief who had many run-ins with the law before his passing. He'd fled to Europe and eventually the US, where he passed away in 2004. But while he was on his deathbed, he confessed to his wife that he was the one who broke into the museum that night, more than 2 decades earlier. When it comes to fine musical instruments, few are as iconic or valuable as the Stradivarius violin. These instruments not only sound amazing in the right hands, but they need to be cared for correctly to ensure they remain in good condition. Many factors can impact the condition of a violin, such as the polish used on the wood, the case that it's kept in, the humidity of the area that it's stored and played in. And it's because of this, the humid conditions on the night of the 28th of February, 1936, that Polish violinist Bronislaw Huberman decided not to play his Gibson Stradivarius during a performance at Carnegie Hall. He was worried that the humidity would have an adverse effect on the violin's wood, and so he played his second-best violin instead, leaving the Stradivarius behind in his dressing room. That same night, a far less skilled violinist, Julian Altman, was also at the hall, but not as a performer. Altman was well known by staff at the hall since he worked at the Russian Bear, a restaurant next door. He was a competent violinist and had been given permission to practice in the hall's dressing rooms when they were not in use. That night was no different, and when he arrived at the hall's entrance, the doorman allowed him to enter. He had his violin in his hand, or so it was thought, since it was still in its case, and hence no one would have suspected that he was planning a heinous act. When Huberman took the stage for his performance, Altman silently snuck into his dressing room and placed the Stradivarius in his empty violin case. When Huberman returned to his dressing room, he was distraught to find that the violin was missing, and a search was immediately started. But since Altman was well liked by the hall's staff, he was never even questioned. No one believed he would commit such a crime, and he merely walked out of the building with a priceless violin without any issues. He decided to sell it, but the pawnbroker that he approached told him that such a valuable piece would immediately draw attention, and he refused to buy it. Hence, Altman decided that he had only one choice: to keep the instrument for himself. One would imagine that he would play it in secret for fear of being caught, but this was not the case. He would regularly perform in bars in the Washington area, and on many occasions would get so inebriated after his performance that he would go home, leaving the instrument behind. Strangely, no one ever noticed that he was playing a priceless Stradivarius. In 1968, he moved in with a woman named Marcelle Hall, who by all accounts was a despicable human being who spent more time drunk than sober, and who often became very abusive towards those around her. When Altman got into trouble with the law, he was sure to be sent to prison, and this greatly angered Marcelle, since she had signed all her possessions over to him, despite the couple never getting married. If he remained in jail, she would be ruined, and so she hatched a plan. She flew to Las Vegas, where he was to be sentenced, and the two got married. And while in prison, it was discovered that Altman had stomach cancer, and knowing that his time was short, he asked to speak to Marcelle. He told her to check the space between the two covers of his violin, and when she did so, she found several articles about the stolen violin. He then confessed that he was the thief who stole it. He passed away as a result of cancer while still incarcerated, and for her role in solving the mystery of the stolen violin, Marcelle was paid a $263,000 finder's fee. In 2009, Monty Te'o was considered one of the US's most promising upcoming football players. At the time, he was part of the Notre Dame team, but he struggled to fit in with other players since he was raised as a Mormon and was now playing for a Catholic university. That same year, he met a woman named Lennay Kekua on Facebook, and the two started chatting. In 2011, she informed him that her father had fallen ill and that they started talking more often, sometimes even speaking to each other on the phone. They soon fell in love, despite having never met, and Te'o would later state that he felt good about helping her through a difficult time in her life. As he got to know Kekua better, he fell more deeply in love, as she seemed to share his interest and valued the same principles that he did. He soon started seeing a future with her, but he was left baffled when she always had an excuse as to why they couldn't meet up or talk over FaceTime. In 2011, Te'o got the news he was eligible for the NFL draft, but he declined and decided to stay with Notre Dame, his relationship with Kekua being one of the deciding factors. The following year, he learned that Kekua had been in a car accident and that she'd been placed on life support and was in critical condition. While receiving treatment, it was discovered that she had leukemia, and Te'o would speak to her on the phone often, sometimes for as long as 8 hours at a time. In the meantime, those close to Te'o started to suspect that not all was as it seemed. Kekua seemed to always have an excuse for not seeing him, and she was constantly struggling with one issue or another. They believed she was either extremely unlucky or that something more sinister was going on. Te'o's best friend, Robbie Toma, started to do some digging, and was unable to find any evidence of the supposed car accident. Then on the 12th of September 2012, Teo's life took a turn for the worse. He was informed that his grandmother had passed away, and that on the same day, Kekua had passed away due to leukemia. He was left distraught, but decided to dedicate the rest of his season to his lost loved ones, and he expressed this to the press. He continued to speak with Kekua's brother and sister, and after one game in Los Angeles, met with her cousin. But then in December of that year, Kekua's sister informed him that she hadn't passed away, and he was left extremely confused. In February of the next year, Kekua revealed that she was actually named Naya Tuyesosopo, and that she'd been catfishing Teo all those years. Not only had she created Kekua as a fake persona, but she also acted as her own sister, brother, and cousin, who he met in Los Angeles. She explained that she'd become too invested in the relationship and was unable to end it, fearing that it would break her heart as well as Teo's. He became the butt of many people's jokes online and experienced a lot of trauma, but managed to work through it and ended up playing in the NFL for the San Diego Chargers, the New Orleans Saints, and Chicago Bears. For decades since the end of World War II in 1945, an urban legend suggested that the German military had a train filled with gold and other valuables somewhere in southwest Poland. It was said that this was done during the very last days of the war, and the train was left in a tunnel, after which that tunnel was sealed to hide it from the outside world. This led to many different theories, the most prominent being that the armored train set out from Wrocław and was expected to arrive at Waldenburg Station, but it was never seen again. Hence, many people believe that it was abandoned in an old coal mine, which is situated in the Owl Mountains. According to conspiracy theorists, the train held around 330 tons of gold, artwork, weapons, and other valuables. While most people shrugged the train's existence off as nothing more than a mere rumor, the Polish Armed Forces and People's Republic decided to conduct several searches in case it really did exist, but they never found any evidence that any of the theories were based in reality. Since the German soldiers, who were said to be responsible for hiding the train, were retreating from the advancing Russian Red Army amidst airstrikes and heavy fire, it was seen as most improbable that they would have time to conceal the train properly, if it ever existed. Furthermore, once they retreated, the Red Army would surely have come across the newly concealed tunnel and suspected that something was hidden there, but this was not the case, and so most people shrugged the rumors off as nothing more than fiction. Among those who believed the fantastical tale were treasure hunters who spent decades searching for the train without success. Hundreds of conspiracy theories were posted online, and despite the lack of evidence, thousands of people remained adamant that the train would be found one day. Then, in 2015, the story took a much unexpected turn. A law firm contacted the authorities, stating they were representing two men, Peter Koper and Andreas Richter, who hailed from Poland and Germany, respectively. They'd revealed that thanks to a deathbed confession by a man who they knew, they were able to locate the train, and they started negotiating with the Polish government for a finder's fee of 10% of the value of the train's contents. If this was agreed to, they stated they would release the location of the train. Their terms were agreed to, and ground-penetrating radar was used at the supposed location of the train, and it was confirmed with 99% probability that a 320-foot train had been located. Soon, treasure hunters descended on the area, but they were warned to stay away, since the train and its contents had likely been booby-trapped by German soldiers before abandoning it in the tunnel. Since then, digging has been done at the site, but nothing has been found so far, and only time will tell whether the train really does exist, or whether it will continue to live on in folklore only. As people start to enter their golden years, they often decide to move to a care home where professional nurses and carers make sure that they're comfortable and that their medical needs are met. But over the years, some of these institutions have gained a bad reputation for their treatment of the elderly, usually thanks to one or two staff members who, for some reason, choose to abuse their power to take advantage of people who are less able than they are. One such nurse who was eventually made to pay for her crimes is Elizabeth Wetlaufer, who is employed at a long-term home in Woodstock, Ontario. According to her fellow nurses, she came across as a very professional individual who seemed to truly care for her patients. But unbeknownst to them, she was struggling with addictions to alcohol and other illegal substances, and eventually she could no longer hide it. She was accused of showing up to work while still intoxicated, and at one point was found passed out in the building's basement when she was supposed to be working the night shift. She also started making mistakes as a result, and on 4 different occasions would be suspended for either giving her patients the wrong medication or the wrong doses. These errors would eventually lead to her being fired. With a bad record to her name, she struggled to find employment as a nurse, but eventually landed a position in London, Ontario, at Meadow Park Care Centre. But she would also lose this job after she was forced to check into a rehabilitation center for the same issues. Following this, she drifted from one temporary job to another, while regularly getting into trouble and being fired. She at one point admitted that she'd been stealing medication and that she nearly caused one patient to pass away after she made a mistake with their medication while under the influence of an illegal substance. It's at this point that she started writing poetry, but not the kind that you might expect. She'd started having thoughts of ending someone's life and would express this in her poems. She would later state that she'd become angry with life and that the stress of taking care of the elderly started to take a toll on her. While it's understandable that such a role can be stressful, what Wetlaufer did to deal with it was unforgivable. In September of 2016, the police got a call from the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, where Wetlaufer was being treated. The police were informed that she'd confessed to ending the lives of several of her patients, and that she attempted it in the lives of several more. She then wrote a 4-page confession in which she stated she ended the lives of 7 people and she attempted to end the lives of 2 more. Shockingly, she admitted to her crimes to one of her former partners and to a priest years earlier, but neither believed her, and they didn't report the crimes to the authorities. She was found guilty and sentenced to 8 life sentences with eligibility for parole after 25 years. Richard Kuklinski, also known as the Iceman, had a tough childhood. He was born to an alcoholic mother and father, both of whom would assault him and his brother, and this would eventually lead to his brother losing his life. He was small in stature as a child, and as a result was badly bullied by those around him. He claimed his first life when he was 13 years old, when he retaliated against one of these bullies and assaulted him with a wooden dowel. He then decided to go after the rest of the boy's friends, and they all barely escaped with their lives. As his life progressed, he grew ever more accustomed to ending lives, but he held fast to one rule: he would never attack any women. Kuklinski would eventually start working for the Gambino crime family as a debt collector, and by this time, he was no longer a small man, but stood at 6 foot 5 inches tall, weighing around 300 pounds. As he ascended the ranks in the family, he became a hitman who would end the life of anyone who he was ordered to. This included witnesses, police officers, or rival gang members. He used any weapon that was at hand, such as firearms, tools, poison, sharpened blades, and even crossbows. On several occasions, he would place his victims in freezers after the fact, earning him the nickname the Iceman. Since he had no set modus operandi, the authorities were unable to pin any particular crime on him. In 1980, he ended the life of George Malibran after they got into an argument about an unpaid debt. The following year, he attacked and ended the life of his partner, Lois Mazgay, whose body would be found 2 years later. In 1982, he entered into a partnership with Dan Deppner and Gary Smith, but he found them to be incompetent and also ended their lives. The police were certain that he was responsible, and so they placed Kuklinski under surveillance. During one taped conversation, he detailed how he would use cyanide to do away with some of his victims, and he was arrested. He would eventually confess to ending Mazgay's life, and he was found guilty of the crimes that he'd committed. He was sentenced to life in prison and passed away while still incarcerated after being diagnosed with Kawasaki disease, which usually only affects children under the age of 5. The story of Carolyn Bryant is one that angered a lot of people when the truth finally came out, since she was responsible for a young man losing his life when he was, in fact, completely innocent. The saga started on the 24th of August, 1955, while Bryant was doing some grocery shopping in Mississippi. At the same time, a young man named Emmett Till was visiting his relatives in that area. He was originally from Chicago, and he could never have expected what happened next. Bryant flew into a rage and accused Emmett of whistling at her while she was doing her shopping. He vehemently denied the allegation, but given the state of politics at the time, his pleas fell on deaf ears. 3 days later, he'd gone missing, and to the shock of his family, he was found deceased in the Tallahatchie River. He was badly assaulted, and his life was ended with a firearm. It was immediately assumed that Roy Bryant, Carolyn's husband, and his half-brother, J.W. Millam, were all behind the crime, and they were taken into custody to stand trial. At the proceedings, Carolyn testified that Emmett verbally harassed and whistled at her before physically grabbing her, though she'd said nothing about his becoming physical in her initial accusation. They were both acquitted of the crime, likely due to a lack of evidence, but both men would later confess that they were indeed guilty, and they wanted to send a message to other people that this kind of behavior was unacceptable. Following this, Carolyn disappeared from the public eye, though at the time it wasn't known why, but the truth would emerge many years later. It would then come to light that Carolyn had disappeared into isolation, thanks to the guilt that she was feeling over Emmett's death. She admitted that she'd almost had no recollection of that day in the grocery store, but she recalled that he had entered the store to buy some gum. When she was 72 years old, she finally admitted that Emmett never harassed her and that she fabricated the entire story for reasons unknown. She also stated even if those events really did happen, he didn't deserve to have his life ended over the matter, and she was very remorseful over what she had done. The magnitude of the matter only hit her once she found out that her husband had ended Emmett's life, and she retreated from the public eye out of shame. Robert Durst was born into the world of real estate. His father owned a very successful real estate company, and when Robert completed high school, he studied economics at Lehigh University, from which he graduated in 1965. Following this, he started studying at UCLA, and while there, he met Susan Berman, who was the daughter of a well-known gangster. In 1973, he moved back to New York, where he met and married dental hygienist Kathleen McCormick. He started working for his family's real estate company and proved to be very proficient at it. In the meantime, his marriage was suffering. Kathleen stated that he was extremely controlling and was prone to fits of violence. Shortly after she made these claims, she disappeared, but Durst explained he'd taken her to Katona train station, where he dropped her off. He claimed that she was on her way back to the city after she'd spent the weekend at their house in South Salem. He added he had no hand in her disappearance, despite the allegations that she'd made against him, and several people who knew the couple came forward to report that they'd seen Kathleen after she returned to their house in Manhattan. No one was identified as a suspect, and no evidence was ever found to implicate anyone in her disappearance. Durst remained in the family business, but would often relocate to different states across the country. When he found out that the case into Kathleen's disappearance was being reinvestigated, he fled to Galveston, Texas. Here, he rented a cheap apartment and disguised himself as a woman and claimed to be unable to speak. During the investigation, Susan was approached by investigators who believed she could provide them with important information, but before she could be questioned, she was found deceased. The police had received an anonymous letter stating that a body would be found at her address in Beverly Hills, only the location was misspelled. Durst remained in disguise, but in 2001, he returned to his house in Galveston to find his neighbor sitting in his living room watching TV. He would later claim he had to fight for his life after the man pointed a firearm at him, and he ended his life before disposing of his remains in the Galveston River. He was eventually tracked down and arrested, but he managed to escape and relocate to Pennsylvania. There, he was caught shoplifting and he was arrested. He was acquitted of the crime against his neighbor, but was sent to jail for 6 months after being found guilty of jumping bond and a few other minor charges. In 2012, he met with 2 journalists who were in the process of making a documentary about him, and while alone, unaware that his microphone was still on, he uttered the words, "What did I do?" Killed them, of course. The journalist also found a note that was written to Susan, in which Beverly Hills was misspelled in the same way as the anonymous letter to the police in 2015. He was finally arrested in New Orleans and placed on trial after being charged with ending Susan's life. He pleaded not guilty, but the evidence against him had mounted, and the trial went ahead as planned. At the trial, one of Durst's old friends, Nick Chavin, testified against him, stating that Durst had confessed to Susan that he ended Kathleen's life. In 1993, 24-year-old Lisa Zeigert was living in Agawam, Massachusetts, where she was working as a teacher's aide at the Agawam Middle School. To make extra money, she held a second job as a part-time gift shop employee, and according to her brother, she was enjoying her life, especially while she was working with children. Then, on the 16th of April that year, she failed to show up for her shift at the school. Staff from the school contacted her mother, Dee, to ask if she'd seen her, but she hadn't. Later that day, an employee from the gift shop called to inform Dee that several of her belongings, including her car, coat, pocketbook, and artwork, were at the store. But Lisa was nowhere to be seen. When Dee and Lisa's sister, Sophia, arrived at the store, they found the front and back doors unlocked. They knew that she'd been working the previous night and that she was alone at the store for her entire shift. When a fellow employee arrived for her shift the next day, they found the store still open, with Lisa's belongings still there. Lisa was reported as missing, and a search ensued that lasted for 4 days. On the 19th of April, Lisa was found deceased close to Route 75, less than a mile from the gift shop. An autopsy showed that she'd been attacked with a sharpened blade, likely after she was abducted from the store. No suspects were identified, and for the next 25 years, Lisa's case remained unsolved. But the decision was then made to use DNA technology to reinvestigate the case, and 11 people were identified as possible suspects, but they all refused to provide DNA samples. They were all subpoenaed to provide these samples, and when investigators arrived at the home of 48-year-old Gary Shara, he wasn't home, but his roommate told them that he would let Shara know that he needed to comply. Shara's ex-wife always suspected he was involved in the case, since he had a strange reaction at seeing a news story about the crime on TV. Whenever a news report was being broadcast, he would run to the TV to see what new information had been found. When Shara was told by his roommates that the police were looking for him, he authored 3 letters that were discovered by his girlfriend in her house. She read them and was shocked to find that they were a written confession in which he admitted to ending Lisa's life and apologized to her family and his girlfriend. He stated that he considered turning himself in on several occasions, but could never find the courage to do so. He also stated that he never committed another crime, and this was later confirmed. He added that he'd been fascinated with abduction since he was still young, and attributed his crime to this. He was later found in a hospital in Connecticut where a DNA sample was obtained and matched DNA found at the crime scene. He was charged with ending Lisa's life, and in September of 2019 was sentenced to spend the rest of his life behind bars with no possibility of ever being paroled. Kathy Small was a 19-year-old woman living in Pasadena, California in 1986. At the time, she was living a hard life and resorted to becoming a street worker in order to make ends meet. One night, she told her roommate that she was heading out to meet a man named Bill, who'd asked her to accompany him to Lake Elsinore in Los Angeles, and that she'd be paid $50 to do so. She added that Kathy left the house that night wearing a nightgown. A few days later, she came across a newspaper article in which it was reported that a woman had been found deceased in South Pasadena, and she'd lost her life after being attacked with a blade. Kathy's roommate contacted the authorities, and after being asked to do so, was able to positively identify the deceased woman as Kathy. No suspects were found, and eventually Kathy's case went cold. Then in 2019, 33 years later, a coroner was called to the house of an elderly man who'd passed away from natural causes. His house was located across the street from the spot where Kathy's life was ended, and while in his house, the coroner made a startling discovery. He found photos of women who were seemingly being held against their will, as well as a newspaper article about Kathy's case. It was immediately assumed that this man was the culprit, but when his DNA was tested against samples taken from the crime scene, he was ruled out as a suspect. It was then discovered that several DNA samples from the crime scene in Kathy's case had never been processed. These were sent for testing in 2020, and finally a match was found. The suspect was a man named William Suff, a criminal who was already incarcerated. But he was no ordinary criminal. He'd received a death sentence and was awaiting his execution in San Quentin after he was found guilty of ending the lives of 12 people in Riverside County, crimes that earned him the moniker the Lake Elsinore Killer. Suff was questioned about the case, and he made a full confession. He also admitted to being guilty of the murders, for which he was sent to prison for in the first place. But since Suff was already on death row, no additional charges were brought against him following this confession, since further court proceedings would make no difference in his fate. But in 2019, his sentence was reduced to life in prison, and investigators have stated that they're now looking for a second suspect who may have been involved in Kathy's case, and the investigation remains open. The 2019 fire at Notre Dame Cathedral provided archaeologists with a rare opportunity to study what lay beneath the famous site. They soon revealed a strange mystery. Solving this would solve a centuries-old cold case. One of the most mysterious items to be discovered beneath the Paris landmark was a lead coffin buried beneath the transept crossing at the heart of the cathedral. 2 coffins were actually discovered there by archaeologists working to prepare the area for restoration work. One was quickly identified as belonging to Antoine de la Porte, an important cleric who passed away in 1710. But the identity of the man in the second coffin remained a mystery. Scientists determined the individual had been an accomplished horse rider. The bones of his pelvic bones had deformed due to his time in the saddle. He was given the nickname Le Cavalier. He was obviously a wealthy individual. The location of his tomb showed he'd been buried with great honor. He'd also been embalmed, a practice that was reserved for the wealthy. But even with these clues, experts believed it was unlikely the mystery of his identity would ever be solved. But looking through records of burials at the church offered a potential solution. Joachim du Bellay was an important French writer and poet who lived in the 16th century. Du Bellay changed attitudes towards the French language and literature and argued that it had as much artistic value as Greek and Latin. He was an important figure in the French Renaissance and also had close connections to important figures in the nobility and church. Throughout his life, he suffered from health problems, and he passed away when he was only 36 or 37, on January 1st, 1560. Du Bellay had at one point been a canon of Notre Dame Cathedral, following in the footsteps of his uncle, who was an important figure in the church. At the request of his family, he was buried in Notre Dame's St. Crepin Chapel, alongside other family members. About 200 years after Du Bellay passed away, restoration work took place on the chapel. To everyone's shock, the famous poet's remains were nowhere to be found. Investigations into the mystery turned up no clues. The mystery soon went cold, and it seemed likely it would never be solved. But the 2019 fire offered a rare opportunity to explore the areas of the cathedral that had been off limits before. At first, Du Bellay seemed an odd fit for Le Cavalier. He hadn't held a high position in the church, and it would be very unusual for him to be entombed in such an important place. But examination of the remains showed many similarities to Du Bellay. The poet was a keen horseman. He'd once ridden from Paris to Rome, a feat that almost cost him his life. His health problems were also reflected in these skeletal remains. Experts believe that there is enough evidence to conclude that Le Cavalier is Joachim du Bellay, solving 2 mysteries that many believed would never be solved. When a piece of art goes missing, there's always hope that it'll reappear in a museum collection, solving the mystery. But the story of a Van Dyck sketch that disappeared in 1951 shows that even this doesn't necessarily mean the mystery is solved. In 1957, the Duchess of Buccleuch was visiting a museum at Harvard University when she noticed a sketch that looked a lot like one she had back home in England. It was part of a collection of 37 oil paint sketches made by Anthony Van Dyck and had been in the family for generations. This particular sketch was of a German prince, Wolfgang Wilhelm of Pfalz-Neuburg. The Duchess wrote home about the strange coincidence. A search of the house revealed that the sketch in question was missing. The last time anybody had seen the Van Dyck sketch at Bofton House was in 1951. It was a relatively small piece, and Bofton House had many art collections. It was easy for the sketch to go missing, but now they'd realized it was gone, and work began to get the artwork back. At first, it didn't seem like this mystery would remain unsolved for very long. It would be a strange coincidence if the museum sketch that had prompted the search for the Bofton House art in the first place wasn't the missing artwork. But tracing the sketch from the museum back to Bofton House would be a difficult task. In fact, it would take over 60 years. New research by an art historian solved the mystery of who had stolen the artwork and how it made its way to the US. By the time it had reached the Harvard Museum, the artwork had been sold and resold multiple times. Even in the 50s, it was possible to trace the line of sales back to the Christie's auction house in London. Such a prominent auction house would be expected to do the proper research into where the art had come from. The painting had been sold by an anonymous owner, but it did come with a letter of authentication by Ludwig Goldscheider, an art expert. It was enough for Christie's to promote the art as the genuine article and sold it for £189. But when Goldscheider was contacted, he claimed he'd only given his opinion, not an actual certificate of authentication. He now said that he'd been shown a low-quality piece and that it wasn't the genuine Van Dyck. He could say who the seller was. He'd been approached by another art expert, L.G.G. Ramsay, in 1953. Ramsay claimed he needed money to purchase new curtains and was interested in selling some paintings. Ramsay was an important figure in the British art establishment. He was the editor of a leading art magazine, and his writing had a significant influence on the community. According to Ramsay, he'd purchased the sketch at a market stall and claimed he couldn't remember what the seller looked like. But it's now clear there was no market. In 1951, Ramsay visited Bofton House for the magazine's 1952 yearbook. He was allowed to walk the hall of the manor alone as the owner was ill. His piece didn't feature any mention of the Van Dyck collection, possibly because he didn't want to draw attention to it. The research established that Van Dyck had taken the painting on his visit. The painting sold at Christie's was an authentic work, but it never should have been there. Former President John F. Kennedy is buried today at Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia. The gravesite is simple, with slabs of Cape Cod granite surrounding the eternal flame. But this wasn't always the plan for the grave. A replica, located miles away at Oak Spring Garden Foundation, hinted at a mysterious memorial wreath that disappeared before it could ever be placed on the grave. The wreath started life with a spontaneous memorial created by the soldiers who carried Kennedy's coffin to his grave. The men left their hats and a ring on the grave. It was remembered as a beautiful moment, and Kennedy's brother Bobby Kennedy said the hats should remain there until they turned to dust. Years after Kennedy's funeral, his remains were moved to the permanent gravesite that had been created to accommodate visitors. Replicas of the military hats were placed on the new grave, but opinions had also changed in that time. Now, commentators thought that the military hats were too much and commented that less is more. Just weeks later, the hats disappeared. Few people thought much about them, and the story of their placement was left in the history books. Over 60 years later, volunteers at the Oak Spring Garden Foundation discovered a replica of Kennedy's gravesite while tending to the cemetery there. The Oak Spring Gardens had once been home to Bunny Mellon, a close friend of Jackie Kennedy. She designed the White House's Rose Garden and helped to design Kennedy's gravesite. At first, it was thought that this replica might have been part of that design process, but people who had worked at the gardens in the 1970s revealed it had actually been placed after Kennedy was reburied. Investigations revealed that it had been used to weather and age metal military hats that were used as part of a sculpture. Mellon and Jackie Kennedy had worked with jewelry designer Jean Schlumberger and sculptor Louis Farron to create a metal wreath that would incorporate the military hats, as well as various plants that represented different moments in the president's life and his hopes for the future. The wreath was designed to go around the eternal flame. For years, Schlumberger and Farron worked on the sculpture in secret. Few details were ever revealed to the public, although there were a few news articles published in the late 1960s that referenced the memorial. One stated that it was intended to be placed at the grave in 1969, but that would never happen. Researchers turned to letters between Mellon and Schlumberger for information on what might have happened to the sculpture. Sometime in May of 1970, all mentions of the memorial wreath disappeared from Mellon's letters. Volunteers contacted museums with connections to the Kennedys and the Mellons, hoping for any new information about what had happened to the memorial. Finally, after years of research, they were given a letter that had been sent to Farron from the curator of the Kennedy Library. The library agreed to pay for the sculpture to be boxed up and sent to them. But the letter was sent in 1977, the same year that work on building the library began. Crates that had remained in storage since before the library ever opened were reinvestigated. Curators discovered the metal hats and tree branches, the disassembled pieces of the wreath. Why exactly the sculpture was never placed at the gravesite remains a mystery. It's believed that shifting opinions on the U.S. military in the 1970s may have played a part in this. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in the year 79, its ash preserved the towns of Pompeii and Herculaneum for thousands of years. As archaeologists unraveled the secrets these two petrified towns hold, they solved mysteries that many believed would never be uncovered. One of these is the final resting place of ancient Greek philosopher Plato. In a villa in Herculaneum, archaeologists uncovered a treasure trove of ancient scrolls in the 18th century. It's been described as the only large-scale library from the classical world that has survived in its entirety. The catch is that many of these scrolls are unreadable today. The text was written using a carbon-based ink. When the volcano erupted, it essentially carbonized the scrolls themselves, making it extremely difficult for any text to be made out. Trying to unravel the scrolls has turned many to dust, and researchers had to wait for new technology to emerge. Now, scientists have used X-ray and infrared scanners to uncover the text on these scrolls. The history of the Academy was written by philosopher Philodemus and describes the school set up by Plato. It was here that Plato taught Aristotle and countless others that would take on his philosophies and take them forward. Historians had long known that Plato was buried somewhere on the grounds of the Academy when he passed away, in 348 or 347 BC. But the Platonic Academy in Athens was a large place, and exactly where Plato was laid to rest remained a mystery. Details revealed in the history of the Academy seemed to have solved the mystery and revealed more information about Plato's life. According to the scroll, Plato was laid to rest in a private garden reserved for him. It was close to a sacred shrine dedicated to the Muses. In ancient Greece, the Muses were important mythological figures. Poets like Homer would begin their stories by invoking the Muses. It was believed that they were the inspiration behind the sciences, art, and literature. These were subjects Plato touched on many times during his life. It wasn't only his resting place that the scroll revealed. For centuries, there's been debate about Plato's final moments. Some claim he passed peacefully in his sleep after listening to music, while others state that he was at a wedding feast. The scroll seemed to support the first theory. It added that Plato was lucid enough to complain about the music being played. Another interesting detail revealed was about Plato's earlier life. Historians have always known he was sold into slavery, but exactly when has always been a mystery. History of the Academy suggests it had been much earlier than experts previously believed, not long after Plato's teacher Socrates lost his life. The information revealed in the history of the Academy may not be groundbreaking, but the technology used to uncover that information could be. There are many more unread scrolls that were pulled from the ashes of Herculaneum, and scholars hope their contents could solve other mysteries about the ancient past. For almost 2 million years, scientists claim that giant apes lived in what is today southern China. Today, the only evidence of their remains are tooth and jaw fossils found in caves near the border with Vietnam. Ever since they were first discovered, scientists have wondered what the Gigantopithecus blacki was like, and what made them go extinct. New research and investigations finally revealed the answer to the mystery. The G. blacki first appeared in the fossil record around 2 million years ago. They were larger than any known ape and may have weighed up to 300 kilograms. Exactly how big they were and what they looked like remains a mystery to this day. remains of these ancient animals went through a complex decomposition process, leaving behind only fragments for scientists to study. But that didn't stop these fossils from capturing people's imagination. The first paleontologist to identify a G. blacki fossil found the teeth being sold in Hong Kong as dragon bones. While we still haven't been able to accurately describe the creatures, scientists have been able to answer another mystery surrounding them. For a long time, it was believed that the giant apes went extinct less than 200,000 years ago. But a more extensive study of 22 cave sites proved this wasn't the case. Instead, the extinction window was estimated to be between 295,000 and 215,000. Accurately dating the extinction was a crucial point in solving the mystery of what caused these incredible creatures to be resigned to the fossil record. After establishing a time frame for the extinction window, scientists looked at the fossilized teeth of G. blacki and the ancestors of orangutans, the closest living relatives to the G. blacki today. They examined samples from shortly before the giant ape went extinct, as well as some from when the G. blacki was at its prime. Together with analysis of pollen and fossil-bearing sediments, scientists could piece together what the apes were like, what they ate, and what kind of environment they lived in. It was that changing environment that changed life for the G. blacki forever. The G. blacki evolved to live in dense subtropical rainforests. The flora was very diverse, offering a wide range of plants, especially trees. Water could be found all year round, allowing a variety of fruit to grow. The apes' favorite diet consisted of mostly fruits and soft leaves. They were highly adapted to living in this environment, which allowed them to thrive and grow to the enormous sizes that they did. But it also meant changes to that environment hit them hard. Between 600,000 and 300,000 years ago, the climate began to shift. The difference between the seasons in the region became more significant. Water availability was restricted to only the rainy seasons. Tree cover became less extensive, and shrubs and grasses associated with forest fires began to take over. All the animals that lived in the area had to adapt. The ancestor of the orangutan managed, but the Gigantopithecus struggled. It fell back onto a diet of twigs and bark. Their large size meant they needed more calories than other ape species, which only made matters worse. Analysis of the teeth showed they weren't suited to this diet or the restricted water availability. The G. blacki communities would have gone through significant stress, gradually dwindling out until no more remained. The study solved the mystery of the giant ape extinction. Scientists hope that by looking back into the past, we can better understand what's happening today and what may come in the near future. In the First World War, countless people lost their lives sailing across the Atlantic Ocean. German submarines patrolled the waters, trying to stop supplies and soldiers from the Americas from reaching Europe. For the most part, the United States ships avoided the peril, but one of these ships was not so lucky. On the morning of July 19, 1918, USS San Diego sank just off the coast of New York. For 100 years, the exact cause of her sinking remained a mystery. But finally, new research found an answer. The USS San Diego was an armored cruiser first launched in 1904. She spent most of her career operating in the Pacific Ocean. After the United States entered the First World War, she was given a new mission. The San Diego would help escort convoys across the Atlantic Ocean, guiding them through the submarine and undersea mine-infested waters. The San Diego had been doing this job for about a year when tragedy struck. It was July 19, 1918. The crew were preparing for another lengthy voyage across to Europe and had recently stocked up on coal fuel for the voyage. She was now sailing to New York under the command of Captain Harley H. Christie. Christie was on high alert. There had been reports of German U-boats in the area, and the experienced sailor didn't want to take any chances of being caught off guard. But it seemed as if the ship was going to safely reach New York Harbor. The San Diego was just passing 8 miles south of Fire Island when a blast shook the ship. The blast was located towards the rear of the ship, below the waterline. Water immediately began flooding in. Sailors tried to close a bulkhead near the blast site. That should have prevented water from reaching the boiler room, but warping made it impossible to close, and the disaster couldn't be averted. Captain Christie ordered they sail straight to the harbor. He worried that the German submarines might be lurking just below the water and didn't want to risk his crew being captured. But just 15 minutes after the initial blast, he had to give the orders to abandon ship. Another 15 minutes later, the San Diego was sitting on the ocean floor. Thankfully, there was no follow-up attack. Of the 1,183 men aboard, only 6 survived the incident. That meant there were a lot of eyewitness accounts for investigators to look into, and there were 2 main theories about what may have happened. It was believed to either have been damaged by an underwater mine or a torpedo. A mine seemed unlikely, as the blast had been near the rear of the ship, but none of the lookouts had noticed the telltale bubble trails that a launched torpedo left in its wake. When looking at eyewitness reports, the investigators had to conclude that a mine had been responsible for the sinking. It was even able to determine which U-boat was responsible. U-156 had been seen in the area, and later reported that it had struck on the San Diego. The U-156 herself would be sunk after hitting a mine in the North Atlantic just a few months later. The Norman Conquest was one of the most significant events in English history. The events of 1066 were woven into the Bayeux Tapestry, preserving the story for centuries to come. But one of the key locations depicted in the tapestry has remained a mystery, and it wasn't solved until 2025. Harold Godwinson was the last Anglo-Saxon king of England. He took the throne after his brother-in-law, Edward the Confessor, passed away, despite agreements that the crown would pass to William of Normandy. Godwinson famously faced William in the Battle of Hastings. The Anglo-Saxon was struck in the eye by an arrow and lost his life on the battlefield. Just a few years after William's victory, the story of the Norman conquest was embroidered into the Bayeux Tapestry. This tapestry is longer than an Olympic-sized swimming pool and resembles a medieval comic strip. The tapestry begins with a scene set in Godwinson's manor. He's just visited his brother-in-law and is now feasting with friends. The images show the Anglo-Saxons drinking from horns before descending a set of stairs to go to the harbor. From there, Godwinson sails to France, where he goes to William and agrees he should be the next king of England. Historians have long known that the manor depicted in the tapestry is at Bosham, a village on the English south coast, but where exactly has remained a mystery. The Bosham Manor features again later on in the tapestry, making it one of the few locations to be shown more than once. It was clearly a significant place and represented Godwinson's base of power. Over the years, there have been efforts to find any trace of the manor. During the Anglo-Saxon period, most homes were made from wood rather than stone, and wouldn't be preserved today. So finding any building from this time period was difficult. In Bosham, villagers had long believed that a manor house in the village was built on the location of the king's final residence, but historians couldn't be sure. They didn't even know if the manor had been in the village itself or elsewhere on the peninsula. In 2006, the current residents of Bosham Manor House hired archaeologists to survey their home. Artifacts dating back to the Anglo-Saxon period were found, but there was nothing to say for certain that this was the famous location. One of the more interesting details uncovered was the remains of a latrine. At the time, the archaeologists didn't know the significance of the find, but over the next few decades, historians developed a greater understanding of the Anglo-Saxon architecture. Beginning in the late 10th century, wealthy Englishmen began to install latrines in their homes. It was a feature reserved only for the extremely wealthy. This meant the earlier find represented a significant clue in the investigation. Historians investigating power bases of the Anglo-Saxon period returned to the Bosham mystery in a study published in 2025. They assessed the information gathered from the previous digs and went back to the Bosham Manor House to find more information. The latrine provided the biggest clue that this was actually the former residence of Harold Godwinson, but it wasn't the only piece of the puzzle. Archaeologists found remnants of ancient buildings and were able to show the nearby medieval church had once connected to Godwinson's estate. The researchers stated that they were now sure beyond a reasonable doubt that Bosham Manor House was the site of the home of the last Anglo-Saxon king and the place depicted in the famous tapestry. Jumbo was once the most famous elephant in the world. But the final moments of his life have been shrouded in mystery and conspiracy for decades. In 2018, a new study and documentary revealed the answer and finally put the conspiracy theory to rest. Jumbo's life was full of tragedy. The African elephant was captured by humans when he was just 4 years old, after they took the life of his mother. He was sold to a zoo in Paris and then to the London Zoo in 1865, where he would spend most of his life in a stable too small to house him. During the day, he gave rides to children, sometimes with as many as a dozen on his back. Jumbo lived in London for 17 years, but in 1882, he was growing difficult to manage. He'd hit the elephant equivalent of puberty, and night rages made zoo staff worry about the safety of keeping him. He was sold to infamous circus showman P.T. Barnum, who took him across the Atlantic to the U.S. Jumbo was the first elephant most Americans had ever seen. Ticket sales from the first 2 weeks of his show covered the cost of purchasing him and his shipping. For 3 years, Jumbo was the star of the show, but tragedy struck in September of 1885. The circus was in Ontario, Canada, when it stopped in St. Thomas. Jumbo and the other animals at the circus were being led to their boxcar after their performance when an unscheduled freight train thundered towards them. According to Barnum, Jumbo had forced another small elephant named Tom Thumb off the tracks before he was struck himself. Tom Thumb suffered a broken leg, but was otherwise all right. But Jumbo suffered significant wounds and passed away just minutes later. Not long after the disaster, rumors spread that the entire thing had been staged. Barnum wasn't known for treating his human performers well, and there was no reason to believe the animal stars fared any better. Many believed that Jumbo was already sick at the time, and that Barnum had the elephant led towards the train to cover up any mistreatment. Jumbo's remains continued to tour with the circus for years before being displayed in various museums. His skeleton was sold to the American Museum of Natural History. For over a century, there have been many unanswered questions about the famous elephant. Barnum advertised him as the biggest elephant in the world, but never let anybody measure him. But more significantly, many still wanted answers about what really happened on the night he passed away. Scientists working with a documentary crew in 2018 were finally able to answer some of those questions. By examining his skeleton, they determined that Jumbo was shorter than Barnum claimed, but still stood at 3.2 meters tall. He was still 20% larger than the average height of elephants his age. Experts could also see that he wasn't in good health when he passed away. The joints in his knees resembled those of a 60-year-old elephant. Jumbo was only 24. His diet was also made up of soft hay, grasses, and oats, rather than the tree bark and twigs he would have eaten in the wild. This meant his teeth didn't wear down in time before his replacement teeth grew in, which could have caused significant pain. But examining photos taken shortly after Jumbo passed away showed that there had been no conspiracy surrounding his passing. The most significant damage was done to Jumbo's rear flank, suggesting he'd been trying to get away when the train struck, and he wasn't being led towards it as some had claimed. Charles Dickens is one of the most famous writers of all time. When he passed away in 1870, he left behind more than a dozen novels, many more novellas and short stories, and several works of nonfiction. He also left behind 10 short pieces of writing in an indecipherable script that remained a mystery for more than 150 years. In 2022, the Dickens Code Project announced a major breakthrough in one of these letters. Dickens had taught himself a form of shorthand that's no longer in use today, and Dickens himself described it as a savage stenographic mystery. But it came in useful for the writer. Dickens used the shorthand for everything from court reporting to writing notes to copying letters he sent to others. To add to the confusion, Dickens personalized the shorthand. He added symbols for words he often used. It would have made note-taking much quicker, but rendered them impossible for most people to read. Dickens called it the devil's handwriting. During his life, Dickens burned most of these notes, but a handful survive today. One of these is the Travis Stock letter. The letter was written in blue ink on paper with the letterhead of Travis Stock House, a house in London where Dickens lived in the 1850s. It was preserved in a New York library, but it would take an international effort for its contents to be revealed. In 2021, the Dickens Code Project appealed for help cracking the case. The The project was made of a group of Dickens scholars who'd been working to decipher the great writer's work. They provided tutorials in the symbols that had already been figured out and looked for suggestions for the rest of the letter. Over 1,000 people downloaded a copy of the letter, hoping to solve the mystery. Only 16 people submitted solutions, and none of these could decipher the full letter. But it was enough for the true contents to be revealed. The Tavistock letter dated to 1859 and was addressed to the editor of the London Times. It was an interesting time for Dickens. The writer had previously co-owned a periodical named Household Words with publishers Bradley and Evans. But Dickens had fallen out with the publishers and decided to set up his own publication, all the year round. It was in this periodical that he released A Tale of Two Cities and Great Expectations. According to the newly deciphered letter, Dickens had sent an advertisement for his new publication to the Times. He was leaving household words behind and wanted his old readers to know where they could find his new work. A clerk at the Times had rejected the advertisement. He was worried about the legalities of the wording in the advertisement and didn't want to get in trouble. Dickens was obviously upset. In the letter, he argued that there was no problem with the advertisement. In fact, he was using the phrasing that a judge had ordered. With the mystery solved, Dickens' scholars discovered they actually had the response to the Tavistock letter. The Times manager wrote back to Dickens apologizing for the problem. Dickens' advert was published for 3 days. All the year round went on to be a successful publication, with Household Words struggling without Dickens' stories. Archaeologists were searching for a funerary temple near Luxor when they discovered something much more significant in 2020. The discovery of the long-lost city of Aten showed a mystery that had been puzzling Egyptologists for decades. Officially called the Dazzling Aten, the city of Aten has also been dubbed the Lost City of Gold by historians. It flourished during the reign of Amenhotep III, some 3,400 years ago. The city was a hub for artisans and craftsmen serving the nearby capital, Thebes. Gold flowed from nearby mines through refineries and casting molds, becoming amulets and jewelry that were worn by most important people in the kingdom. But during the reign of the infamous Akhenaten, the city was destroyed. Akhenaten mandated that only the sun god, Aten, be worshipped, while all other ancient Egyptian gods were abandoned. He moved the kingdom's capital and took away power from the priests of gods like Amun. Even after Akhenaten's reforms were reversed, the city named after the god he worshipped never reached the same level of power again. With a nickname like the Lost City of Gold, it's not surprising that Egyptologists were keen to locate Aten. It wasn't only the promise of treasures that was attractive to the experts. They hoped that Aten would provide insight into what life was like during one of Egypt's golden ages, and the strange transition period from polytheism to Akhenaten's monotheism. But searches for the lost city turned up nothing. It was only by accident that this mystery was solved. In 2020, archaeologists were looking for the funerary temple of the pharaoh Tutankhamun. They began a dig in the west bank of Luxor, near the Valley of the Kings, where the boy king's tomb was found. The location was near other funerary temples from the period and seemed like a good candidate for Tutankhamun's. But not long into the dig, they realized they'd found something much bigger. The dig had actually uncovered the southern area of the lost city. Over the next 4 years, archaeologists would reveal a city stopped in time. Workshops, residential areas, and public buildings were revealed. Many had their doorways bricked up. Insides had been left abandoned, as if the people who once lived there were expected to return soon. Tools, jewelry, and pottery were discovered. Hieroglyphics on some of the items showed they dated to the rule of Amenhotep III and the early reign of Akhenaten. It was enough to prove that this was the mysterious lost city of Aten. Researchers confirmed the dazzling Aten had been discovered in 2021, but there was still more to uncover about what life in the city was actually like. It was clearly a wealthy place. Many of the homes had indoor showers. It was also multicultural. Archaeologists found inscriptions in hieroglyphics, Demotic, and Greek scripts. The city would have been well connected in its prime, producing artifacts that would find their way across the kingdom. But archaeologists also found signs of changing times. An image of the sun disk had been etched into a wall. this might have been one of the first steps in Akhenaten's reforms. The area was also resettled many times over the following millennia, but never to the same extent as during its golden years. Why this was remains a mystery. Experts believe there is still much to discover about this ancient site. Gone are the days when criminals who were found guilty of heinous crimes were sent to the guillotine before they were executed. But in the mid-20th century, this was still common practice, and one man, Albert Pierrepoint, stands out as one of the most prolific executioners of his time. Albert was born in Clayton, Yorkshire in 1905, and from the very beginning of his life, his path was set out before him, since both his father and uncle were employed by the British government as hangmen. Most of us would shy away from such a career, but at a very early age, Albert told his parents that he wanted to carry on the family tradition, and that he would also become a hangman one day. He believed that he was put on this earth to carry out that duty, and so, as he reached adulthood, he took the reins from his father and was put to work, ending the lives of hundreds of heinous criminals. Not only did he enjoy his role, but by all accounts he was the best hangman that anyone had ever seen. He was able to carry out executions faster than anyone before him, and in a more humane manner than had ever been used before. But as is the nature of the job, Albert had to make money working a second job, since executions were only carried out sporadically, and he made extra money as a horse drayman grocery delivery man. Some of the criminals that crossed his path on the gallows were Gordon Cummins, known as the Blackout Ripper, John George Haig, who was found guilty of several murders, and John Amory, who was found to be a German propagandist just as the Second World War was about to start. Following the war, he was sent to Germany and Australia, where he ended the lives of more than 200 war criminals, including the commandant of Auschwitz, Joseph Kramer, and SS guard Irma Gries. But as is often the case, not everyone who met their end at Albert's hands deserved to be executed. In 1955, he had the unfortunate job of executing Ruth Ellis, a woman who'd been the subject of domestic abuse at the hands of her husband for years. She and David Blakely met in 1953 while she was working in a club in Kensington called the Little Club. They soon fell in love and David moved in with her, even though he was already engaged to another woman. But Ruth was also in a relationship with Desmond Cusson, an RAF pilot, and she elected to move in with him instead, but continued to spend time with David, which angered him, and before long he started to become abusive. David eventually asked for her hand in marriage and she said yes, but the abuse continued. At one point, she decided to confront him at the home of a woman whom he was seeing, but when he spotted her arriving, he fled in his car. Ruth followed him to the Magdala pub, and when he walked out of the building at 9 p.m., she produced a firearm when he refused to acknowledge her and fired at him. She missed and he tried to flee, but her second shot was on target and she ended his life. She was found guilty of murder and sent to the gallows, where Albert had no choice but to carry out his duty, or face a harsh punishment if he had refused. It's believed that the injustice in this very case had a great impact on the community, and that it contributed to the death penalty being abolished decades later. Number 9. Today, there's no doubt that Edward Kelly, who lived in the 16th century, was a con man. But at the time that he was alive, he was seen as a spiritualist, and by some as a miracle worker, who would converse with angels and turn base metals into gold. It's believed that Kelly was born in Worcestershire, England, in 1555, and not much is known about his early years. Historians believe that he found his first job as an apothecary's assistant, and that he possibly studied at Oxford, but under the pseudonym of John Talbot. What is known is that he did receive some type of formal education, since he could speak Latin and possibly Greek. In 1582, while studying as John Talbot, he met John Dee, who was known to have conducted experiments in which he was attempting to contact angels, a practice he called spiritual conferences. To do this, he used a scrying device called a crystal gazer, but up to this point, all of his efforts had failed. But all this was about to change when he met Kelly, who told him that he'd already contacted angels, and he became Dee's scryer. For the next 7 years, the two men were inseparable. Kelly owned an alchemy book called the Book of Dunstan, which he used, along with a mysterious red powder, to turn base metals into gold. He claimed that he'd been led to this strange powder, along with a friend, John Blockley, by a spiritual being of some sort. He stated that they'd been led to the Northwick Hill, where the powder was revealed to them, and using the Book of Dunstan, he could use the powder to prepare a type of tincture that would allow these metals to be transmuted. We know that there's no way this was possible, but the people of the 16th century were easily fooled, as accounts from that time state that Kelly successfully demonstrated this ability on several occasions. The two men moved to Central Europe, where they stayed for many years, and while there, they continued their research into contacting angels, though it's said that Dee was far more interested in this than Kelly was. They eventually befriended Willem Rosenberg, a Count of Bohemia, and they moved to the Czech Republic. It's believed that Kelly started to grow wearisome of the spiritual conferences, and in a bid to end them, he told Dee that an angel had told him that the two men should share everything they owned, which strangely included their wives. Kelly had started amassing some wealth, and thanks to his work in alchemy, but Dee didn't agree with his plan, and agreed that the spiritual conferences were leading nowhere, but he did still share his wife with Kelly. They eventually parted ways in 1588 and never saw each other again. In the meantime, Kelly had become very rich. He duped many powerful and influential people into believing that he could create gold out of base metals. But when he failed to duplicate his results for Emperor Rudolph II, he was arrested and imprisoned. Rudolph believed that spending some time in prison would encourage Kelly to produce large amounts of gold, and after agreeing to do this, Kelly was released. When his efforts failed again, he was arrested once more and sent to prison. It's said that in 1597, he tried to escape and was almost successful, since he made it out of his cell, which was located in one of the towers of the prison. But he miscalculated the distance to the ground, and upon discovering that his rope wasn't long enough, he fell and broke his leg. Since this type of injury was pretty serious back then, and since prisoners didn't receive much medical care, he passed away as a result at the age of 42, and his long career as a dangerous con man had finally come to an end. Number 8. We're all familiar with the phrase Reign of Terror, but not everyone is aware that it refers to a period in France's history between 1793 and 1794 during the French Revolution. This time was fraught with extreme violence, fear among the public, and executions, often of innocent people. Civil war had broken out, and when enemy forces started surrounding France, the government decided that the best solution would be to instill fear in anyone suspected of standing against the revolution. One of the more prominent characters of the Reign of Terror was Maximilien de Robespierre, who was born in Arras, France, in 1758. He was well acquainted with the law, having studied the subject thanks to his scholarship, and in 1789, he was appointed as the representative of the Arras commissioners in the Estates General. He was known to be a radical Democrat, and since he was dedicated to civil morality, he became known as the Incorruptible. He stood firmly behind the French Revolution and decided that King Louis XV should stand trial for treason, an opinion that many Parisians shared. In 1793, Robespierre was elected to the Committee of Public Safety, which was created to protect France from domestic and foreign enemies, and before long the committee started controlling the French government. He and his followers believed that the aim of the French Revolution was to create a virtuous republic that would follow the will of the general public, but they feared that people with opposing morals would derail this plan, and that their corruption would lead to the downfall of the republic. The solution, Robespierre felt, was to identify and eliminate those people as quickly as possible, and what followed was truly a reign of terror. He's quoted as stating, "Terror without virtue is fatal. Virtue without terror is impotent." Hence, the culture of terror in France was born. Anyone who is suspected of supporting tyranny was to be arrested, and among the first to be executed was Marie Antoinette and the Duke of Orleans, as well as Madame Elizabeth, King Louis XV's sister. Any members of the French military who were found guilty of cowardice or defeatism were also executed. Previous French leaders who'd sought to take control of the revolution were hunted down and executed. Members of the old constitutional Feuillants were also rounded up, after which their lives were ended, and the feminist playwright Antoine Lavoisier was executed when it was found that he was associating with the tax-collecting agency Farmers General. As many as 17,000 people lost their lives at the orders of Robespierre, and it's estimated that another 10,000 passed away in prison, many of whom never received a fair trial, or any at all. Number 7. In modern times, it isn't uncommon for people to get plastic surgery on parts of their bodies that they're unhappy with, especially since the technology has progressed exponentially over the years, and botched surgeries are far less of a common occurrence. But these procedures can be very expensive, and so some people choose to have surgeries done under less than ideal circumstances, such as allowing unqualified people to perform the procedure. It's a very risky strategy that rarely pays off, but these types of bogus practitioners usually don't care much about their patients, as long as they receive the payment that they've been promised. In 2017, one of these people, a 19-year-old woman named Jingyi Wan, also known as Dr. Kitty, was exposed after some of her patients complained that they'd suffered from complications after receiving treatment from her. Once this came to light, it was also discovered that Wang never graduated from high school and never received any training to perform this type of plastic surgery, leaving many people wondering why she thought the procedures would be successful. It all started in April of that year, when Wang started advertising procedures such as face slimming on flyers at a restaurant in Toronto. Included in the ad was a barcode that could be scanned with a smartphone, after which more information would be displayed. Investigators believed that she may have placed more flyers in other areas in the city, and that hundreds of people may have considered using her services, despite the fact that Wang was in no way qualified. A woman whose name has not been made public responded to the ad and visited Wang at her home, after which she underwent a face-filling procedure. But a few weeks after it was completed, she developed an infection. She consulted a qualified plastic surgeon in Toronto to perform a corrective surgery once this infection was under control. It was then discovered that Wang was using Botox to help shrink the muscles in her patients' faces, making their faces appear slimmer. It was also revealed that she hailed from China and that she was in Toronto to study English at a private institution, where she was meant to remain for 2 years on a student visa. Upon finishing her studies, she hoped to enroll at a Canadian college to further improve her command of the English language. But when news of her misdeeds broke, it was announced that she faced deportation back to China, and her father flew to Toronto to support her while she was being investigated. She was charged with aggravated assault, and according to her lawyer, was terrified of what might become of her if found guilty. The charges stemmed from just one complaint, but investigators were certain that other victims existed and urged them to come forward, but it isn't known if anyone ever did. After an initial hearing, she was freed on $4,000 bail, but very little information is available on what happened next and whether she was ever deported. Number 6. Most of us are familiar with the name Lee Harvey Oswald, the man who ended the life of former U.S. President John F. Kennedy on the 22nd of November, 1963. But some people are surprised to learn that a man with a very similar name was once also implicated in an attempt on a president's life. On the 5th of May, 1979, President Jimmy Carter was set to deliver a speech at Los Angeles' Civic Center Mall. But the day didn't turn out as planned, since a man named Raymond Lee Harvey, along with an accomplice, Osvaldo Espinoza Ortiz, were about to enact a plan to end his life. Harvey was spotted in the crowd by the U.S. Secret Service when one agent realized that he was carrying an item that looked a lot like a firearm. They immediately pounced on him, and when the item was retrieved, it was indeed a firearm, but it was a non-lethal starter pistol. Nevertheless, he was taken into custody and questioned, and that's when the plot to end Carter's life came to light. 35-year-old Harvey stated that he was merely supposed to serve as a distraction in the plot, as he'd been told to discharge the harmless weapon once he got close to the president. He was told to aim at the ground before firing, so that it wouldn't be immediately obvious where the shot had come from. The plan was that this would cause chaos to ensue, giving the real assassins the chance to carry out their task. He claimed that 3 other men were involved in the plot, one of whom was 21-year-old Espinoza Ortiz. The second man was tracked down and arrested, but after he was questioned, agents believed the tale to be a fabrication, and the pair was handed over to the police. Harvey was charged with attempting to assassinate the president and held on $50,000 bail. Espinosa Ortiz was considered to be a material witness and hence was held on $100,000 bail, double that of Harvey's. At first, Espinosa Ortiz denied his involvement and stated that he'd never met Harvey, but he eventually admitted that Harvey's version of events was accurate and that they tested the weapon the previous night by firing 7 rounds into the air from the roof of the Allen Hotel. He added that 2 Mexican men were the real assassins, but that they were supposed to fire at the president once the distraction was complete. But since Harvey was arrested before he could discharge his weapon, this never happened. The FBI later learned that Espinosa Ortiz knew the Mexican men well since they frequently spent time in each other's company, and one of the two gave his name as Humberto Camacho when he checked out of the hotel. When his room was searched, investigators found a weapons case and ammunition inside. There was no doubt the plot was a very real one, but due to a lack of evidence and the fact that 2 Mexican men were never identified, the charges against both Harvey and Espinosa Ortiz were eventually just dropped. Number 2. Alexander Salonik is considered to be one of the scariest gangsters to have hailed from Russia. But surprisingly, he originally had ambitions to rid the streets of Moscow of organized crime, after serving in a Soviet Special Forces intelligence unit during the Cold War. Salonik was trained in espionage and infiltration while serving in East Berlin during the war, and there's no doubt that he became a force to be reckoned with, as he also trained in martial arts, small arms operation, and counterintelligence. It's also been suggested that he was part of a secret organization that was tasked with assisting NATO diplomats and Allied military officers when needed, while others claim that he was merely a security guard, though this is highly doubtful. After Salonik's military unit was dissolved, he returned to Moscow, where he set his sights on becoming a military police officer. But his time at the academy was short-lived, as he often pulled scary pranks on his superior officers, and just a few months later, he was discharged for extreme violence towards suspects. He had no choice but to look for a different type of employment, and before long he started working as a gravedigger. He found the work to be boring and backbreaking, but to make matters worse, he was accused by one of his ex-girlfriends of assault, and he was sent to prison for 8 years, despite the evidence against him being extremely flimsy, and the woman at one point recanting her accusation. He seemed to accept his fate, though, and had a single request, that he be given 5 minutes alone with his wife to say goodbye to her. His request was granted, but as soon as the couple was alone, he jumped through a glass plate window, shattering it in the process, and escaped into a nearby wooded area. He somehow managed to evade the police for long enough to make it to Siberia, where he was eventually arrested again. He was in the process of having all his tattoos removed to avoid being recognized. This time, he was sent to a Siberian gulag, where he would perform hard labor every day in freezing conditions. When word got out that he trained as a police officer, he was attacked by 12 men armed with shovels, but he managed to take one of the shovels away from an assailant and proceeded to fight them all off, injuring several of the men in the process. Following this incident, he started working out, and one day he pulled the grate off a ventilation shaft in the prison and escaped to Moscow, where he became involved with organized crime. He was tasked with assassinating members of rival organized crime gangs, and by all accounts, he was very proficient. On one occasion, he ended the life of a crime boss from 300 yards away, and before any of his bodyguards could react, he had ended 6 of their lives before escaping. During another incident, he attempted to blackmail a rival boss but was ignored, and a month later, he and many of his associates were found deceased in different parts of the city, presumably by Salonik's hand. He became notorious and feared in the criminal underground, and was given the moniker Alexander the Great. He was eventually arrested in Moscow, but upon arriving at the police station, he produced a hidden firearm and fled. He ended the lives of 7 officers before he was wounded and apprehended. They would later remark that he was incredibly accurate with his shots, and that he would likely have gotten away if he hadn't been wounded. But 8 months later, he escaped once again with the use of grappling hooks, and he fled to Greece. He underwent plastic surgery to alter his appearance and started his own criminal enterprise. But on the 1st of February, 1997, he was found deceased in his villa, and he was identified by his fingerprints, though it's been speculated that his agents sent a false set of prints to be tested, and that he may have started a new life somewhere else. Number 4. Grigory Rasputin is considered by many to be one of the scariest men to have ever lived, not only because he managed to become a Russian royal advisor, but because many people believed he had supernatural powers. Rasputin, also known as the Mad Monk, grew up in poor conditions in Siberia. Both his parents were illiterate farmers, and hence they struggled to make ends meet. This is one of very few facts that are known about his childhood, but it's known that he married a woman called Praskovia Duravina. They went on to have 7 children together, but only 3 survived into adulthood. In 1897, he traveled 300 miles to visit the St. Nicholas Monastery, where he's said to have found religion. Following this, he started traveling, and wherever he went, he claimed to have special powers given to him by God, which allowed him to heal the sick. Many people believed these claims, and before long, word spread to St. Petersburg, and when he traveled there, he was introduced to Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. The Tsar's son suffered from a rare condition called hemophilia, and Rasputin seemingly cured him. The Tsar's wife, Empress Alexandra, became convinced that he possessed mystical powers, and so he soon became ingrained in the ruling Romanov family. But he also gained a reputation as being somewhat of a slob. On more than one occasion, he was seen licking spoons before using them to dish up food for other people, and could regularly be seen with food stuck in his beard. On one occasion, he was apprehended by the police while drunk in public, and he told the officers that he and Empress Alexandra had been intimate before declaring that despite his many sins, he was Christ in miniature. Despite all of this, he remained in the Tsar and the Russian Orthodox clergy's favor, since they believed him to be a mystic who knew their innermost desires. He certainly knew what they wanted to hear, and was only too happy to oblige. He managed to calm the Empress, who suffered from anxiety, and convinced the Tsar to be more confident in his decision-making. Soon, he became the Tsar's advisor despite warnings from the Russian elite. He soon became known all over the world as the Tsar's advisor and spiritual aide, and at one point, it was believed that he'd brought on the cholera epidemic in St. Petersburg in an effort to undermine the war efforts of World War I. Before long, the aristocracy had had enough of Rasputin, and they hatched a plot to have him assassinated. Prince Felix Yusupov invited him to his palace under false pretenses, where Rasputin was served cakes and wine that were laced with poison. But it had no effect on him, and in desperation, the prince produced a firearm and wounded him several times with no effect. As a result, the prince would later claim that Rasputin must have been allied with the devil. A politician also fired at him, and it's believed that one of these shots ended Rasputin's life, finally bringing his life of deceit to an end. Number 3. Ranavalona I is often described as the Mad Queen of Madagascar, or Ranavalona the Cruel, since she's known to have been a ruthless leader who's been likened to Vlad the Impaler. Ranavalona was born to poor parents and never received any type of formal education, but the family's lives changed forever when her father somehow got wind of a conspiracy to assassinate the country's king. He managed to inform the king of this, and as a reward, Ranavalona was adopted into the royal family, and eventually she got married to Prince Radama, becoming the first of his 12 wives. When the king passed away, Radama ascended the throne, but he passed away soon after. Some records state that he was suffering from syphilis or cirrhosis, but many historians believe that he met his demise at the hands of Ranavalona, who'd been poisoning his food and drink with cyanide. Once he lost his life, Ranavalona assumed the position of queen, marking the end of her reign of terror. The king's brother was the rightful heir to the throne, and he attempted to have Ranavalona removed from the palace, but she ordered warriors from her village to protect the palace and end the life of anyone who attempted to enter. Ranavalona had a strained relationship with the rest of the royal family, and so she ordered that they all be executed. Radama's brother was the first to lose his life, and more followed. In 1828, she was officially coronated as queen. She stood firmly against European colonialism and made this stance known to every European country. Any foreigners who were tracked down in Madagascar were immediately deported, and any colonials who'd been given titles had them stripped away. Christianity was immediately banned, and the treaties that had been put in place with Britain and France were nullified. The justice system that was in place was replaced by a system called trial by ordeal. If a person was suspected of a crime, they were forced to ingest poison from a certain plant, and if they became sick as a result, they were found guilty and sent to prison or executed, depending on the crime that they'd committed. All of these changes were made within a few months of Ranavalona being crowned, and predictably, she angered a lot of people. The French government decided that something had to be done, and the city was attacked. For a brief period, they managed to control the city, but were ultimately beaten back by the Queen's soldiers, as well as malaria. The British also attempted to remove her from the throne, but were unsuccessful. With the external threat now no longer an issue, she started focusing on her country, and before long she had set up factories that produced clothing, food, alcohol, sugar, weapons, and ammunition. She became well loved in her own country, but as she aged, she started acting more erratically. She used increasingly cruel methods against her enemies, most of which were too gruesome to even mention here. Tens of thousands of her own people were executed for following the Christian faith, but she remained in power for 33 years before eventually passing away in her palace at the age of 80. Number 2. One of the more fascinating aspects of the history books is the strange beliefs that people used to hold in the past. It's thanks to this that one woman, Mercy Lena Brown, was accused of being extremely dangerous, even after she passed away. The strange case of Mercy Lena Brown started in 1810, when New Hampshire in New England was in the throes of a deadly epidemic. This and other diseases were taking their toll on the population of the region at the time, and doctors were at a loss of what to do, since many people, in some cases entire families, were losing their lives at a rapid rate. Wasting illness was also spreading and left sufferers with significant weight and muscle loss, causing them to look as if they'd already passed away when they were in fact still alive. Before long, superstitions started to spread, despite the best efforts of doctors who tried to explain that it was merely a physical condition. This gave rise to the vampire panic that took New England and Europe by storm. People started reporting seeing deceased people walking around the streets at night, and they could not be persuaded that these were really patients suffering from one disease or another. Some of these accounts were reported to the media, who only further exacerbated the situation by claiming that vampires were walking the streets, and that in other parts of the world, these creatures are being wiped out thanks to certain rituals that were performed, such as piercing their hearts with a wooden stake. Thus started the story of Mercy Lena Brown, who was born in Exeter, Rhode Island in 1872. She and several of her family members fell ill with consumption, and in 1892 she passed away, but not before her mother and sister's lives were lost in the same way. Her father, George Brown, and her brother Edwin survived, and since they never became ill, their neighbors started to spread rumors that Mercy was a vampire while she was still alive, and that she was responsible for the passing of her other family members. When he was confronted with this news, her father permitted the villagers to exhume the remains of his family in a bid to clear their names. Mary lost her life in the winter and was kept in an above-ground crypt, and since she'd just recently passed away, her remains showed few signs of decomposition, which caused even more suspicion. At the time, many people believed that a vampire's heart remains filled with biological material after their passing, and when this was found to be the case when Mercy was examined, it was decided that she was definitely a vampire and still extremely dangerous. By this time, Edwin had also contracted consumption, but the villagers believed they knew of a cure. Mercy's heart was removed, burned, and the ashes were mixed with water. This mixture was then given to Edwin to drink, but he passed away 2 months later. But since no one else in the extended family became ill, the villagers believed that the cure had worked, and they finally rid the area of the threat of vampires. It's said that his account served as inspiration for Bram Stoker's novel Dracula, though this has never been confirmed. Number 1. Emperor Nero is remembered as one of Rome's most notorious rulers, since he was a noted eccentric who had no qualms about displaying his penchant for cruelty and debauchery. He became the 5th emperor of Rome in 54 AD, when he was just 16 years old. But by many accounts, he had very little interest in politics or anything to do with running his empire, instead spending most of his energy on his art. Nero was born on the 15th of December, 37 AD. His mother was exiled from Rome when he was 2 years old, and the next year his father passed away. Having nowhere to go, he ended up living with his aunt, and his inheritance, 1/3 of his father's estate, was stolen. But when Claudius became emperor, he nullified Agrippina's exile and made sure that Nero received his intended inheritance. Claudius and Agrippina got married, and he adopted Nero at the age of 13. Nero soon became Claudius's favorite child, despite having a biological son of his own, and he was informed that he would be Claudius's heir. He passed away in 54 AD, and 2 months before his 17th birthday, Nero took up his role as emperor. He faced no resistance from the Senate and the army, and since he was still very young, his mother had great influence over his decisions, at least for the time being. Eventually, he grew tired of her input and decided to have her executed, though there's no verifiable evidence to support this. When he was 23 years old, Nero faced the first real threat to his rule. Queen Boudica decided to invade Rome and quickly destroyed several important settlements. It's believed that she was appalled at the greed of the Romans and the fact that they had attacked the king of the Iceni tribe and his family. Her forces were eventually defeated, but not before she laid waste to Colchester, St. Albans, and London. Nero was married to Octavia by this point, but it was an arranged and troublesome union. He was having an affair, and his mistress convinced him to get a divorce. Nero exiled Octavia, and in 62 AD, he charged her with adultery and had her executed. This caused a lot of controversy, but nothing could be done about it. 2 years later, a fire erupted near the Circus Maximus in Rome, and in a very short time, it spread through the city. For 9 days it raged on, and many historians believe that the fire was started by Nero himself, since he needed to clear land to build a new palace. But he blamed the fire on the Christians, and as a result, many were executed. According to historians, Nero and his mistress were very much in love, but it's said that he ended her life one day when they were arguing. He kicked her during the fight and caused internal injuries that she wouldn't recover from. He would also go on to have his stepsister executed, and he's said to have ended the life of his stepbrother as well. Most historians believe that many of his family members either lost their lives at his hand or by his orders. His life was lost in 68 AD after neglecting his armies. Galba marched on Rome and was eventually made emperor, at long last bringing Nero's tyrannical rule to an end. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.